Thank you all for joining us for the program number 6 here and elsewhere. We're back with all of the filmmakers. And firstly, yeah, I want to thank you all for being here, all of the filmmakers, and thank you all so much for your very powerful films. Rewatching this program again recently, I really kind of was struck by something that Thirza mentions in her video, and kind of saw the whole program in a way as kind of a documentation of post-apocalyptic life in some way, for indigenous peoples, for other marginalized communities, and those experiencing forced migration. And I think Thirza asks a very profound question of how we can continue life and continue to have hope and love within these conditions. And then and another thread that I just wanted to mention as a way to open it up is how kind of within these histories, individuals can and communities can maintain autonomy and kind of resist against state power and violence and the ways that the state regiments our bodies and our lives. And yeah, continuing to insist on other ways to live and to navigate these infrastructures of power. So I kind of welcome anyone to kind of jump in if they want to reflect on some of these ideas. Otherwise, I can kind of go directly to some questions for individual films. We can come back to some of these thoughts. They're kind of in the questions too. So maybe Thirza, we could start with you. And I'm curious to just hear about your process in terms of collecting these images from the various archival sources, and how you write the essay text in relation to the images, if one of those things comes first and then is followed by the other, if they kind of happen in tandem.
Yeah, I mean, the essay text was written first, so I was like going into the databases that had all of these like images and footage and stuff, like with a knowledge of like the kind of images I wanted to collect to put in. And there were some that I'd already collected like previously, like the tar sands image, and the image of me shooting the fertility drugs into myself was like, I shot that myself and mixing the drugs. But yeah, it usually all my films start with like the text, and then the images come from there.
Mm-hmm. So you're then kind of seeking in your kind of research process, looking for images that'll kind of align with some of the texts that you've written.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, pretty much.
Okay. And Melisa, I wondered if you could talk about how you first came to thinking about your family history in relation to geography, and specifically using Google Maps as a way to explore that.
So it started first, the project started with thinking about geolocalization technology and Google Maps, which is the most common tool we use for this technology. And to think about that first in relation to my own situation, which it's very simple. I just left my hometown in Buenos Aires, and I was in France in that moment. I was doing a master. And reflecting about this idea of distance and of basically where is home. But then I decided to connect it to my family history, that is much more interesting, and that is also very marked by this movement, these forced migrations. And it was all around basically this idea of home, of home and of distance, and how geolocalization and Google Maps seem to make the world so approachable in a sense, like so crystal crystal clear, but obviously is not, is quite the opposite. So it was all a playing with these thoughts and connecting all of these feelings and thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Kevin, we'll jump over to you. I feel that, you know, this film is very much in line with a lot of other films that you've made where you kind of approach all different kinds of people, labor, like you're very interested in documenting labor and through a very kind of observational lens. But I just wondered for you in kind of first how you came to want to shoot in this Columbus Air Force Base, but also how, you know, I imagine every situation that you enter into, every context, it determines and shifts the way you might film in that space. But, you know, this is a very specific kind of like military complex. And I just wondered if, like, in what ways did that kind of influence how you might portray the people there?
Yeah, yeah. I shot on this United States Air Force Base in Columbus, Mississippi, and it's the city where my parents are from. So it's an economic engine for that community, and it always has been. I think it's one of the major employees, that and maybe Board of Education or something like that. And then so I made a feature film a couple of years ago called Consular Park that was about African-American election officials. I wanted to make another film about civil servant workers. And a couple of years ago, I had an aunt that passed away. And then there were some relatives that I barely knew, that showed up in military outfits because they were serving at in the Air National Guard. And I was like, so I can film these guys. And then so I thought about where to do it, and it was basically mostly that base because there was a kind of a connection to that kind of, you know, because it was a connection to that city with my folks. And then I still have a lot of relatives who work there, and some relatives that work on that base. And so just when I got down there, you know, I didn't know how formal it was going to be because I've never been on a military base before. I mean, I have relatives in the military, but I've never been on a base before. And then so a lot of things did kind of shift there. I wanted to make like a, you know, mostly all kind of single take stuff, but some of the gestures that he did didn't last as long. So then so it just became this kind of a film about, just kind of pushed the audio out. And then it became a film about all these other folks who had different kind of careers on that particular base, whatever that I didn't know about, so to speak. Yeah. So, yeah.
And
I think, did I answer?
Yeah, you did. Yeah, and kind of the part I'm curious about, and is I think the part that feels very similar to a lot of these other portrait films you've made is that you really focus kind of on the dignity and like of the individual and their kind of dedication to their work. But I just wondered if, you know, kind of being a part of this really kind of intense physical infrastructure of the Air Force and the military, if that, you know, kind of came into your head in a different way than you might like approach like a pole site or, you know, dry cleaning factory or something.
Actually, not really, because for me, I mean, of course, there's like, I mean, of course, I didn't want to show any weapons or anything like that. But you know, I had, you know, grown up, and I think me and another cat were the only African Americans that have bachelor degrees from my hometown. Everybody else went to the military, and for me, it was always just a job. It was never like anything. I mean, well, in the 80s, it was slightly peacetime, I guess you want to call it that. So everybody just went to the military just to work, you know. So and my relatives were a little older, so they didn't serve in Vietnam or any other, and were too old to serve in those Gulf Wars. So I've always known it as people just going to work, so to speak. And then also the military, which sometimes I just found out it's like 40% non-white, you know, so it's almost more than the national average and stuff. So then the whole idea of you know, like in the United States, like here is why most state capitals are black in the, you know, Washington D.C., because the private sector never hired African Americans as much as the government did. So when people talk about cutting taxes and shit like that, and cutting jobs, what they're basically cutting African American jobs. And then so the whole idea of me seeing these things as an opportunity, because there's a guy that's a fireman in there and stuff, and then of course he's going to be a fireman after he leaves the military. So you know, there's all these careers and stuff that are started there, but then they go on to the private sector, so to speak.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's the kind of stuff so I went there thinking like this was the same as filming in a funeral home or filming, you know, in a pole station or filming at a dry cleaner. It was just like these people doing these kind of jobs, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. Anna, I think your film reflects on a really simple yet, you know, incisive and profound question that the Waimiri Atroari people have asked, which is the title of your film, as you mentioned, Aquí, which is why. So can you maybe just begin with that as kind of an entry point into how you approach the film in thinking through this question?
Miki is part of like a larger and very layered amount of research that kind of fell upon me because of the current situation in Brazil and this kind of nostalgia for a return of the military dictatorship that is installed by the current, if we can call it a government, because I don't even think it's that. And what happened was that I was part of a larger project of researching the histories of the military dictatorship in Brazil with other people, trying to change a little bit the image of the military dictatorship as something that in Brazil was only responsible for the disappearance, or the forced disappearance of 424 people, mostly coming from the major cities in Brazil, mostly coming from a white bourgeoisie of the main cities there. And the effort of the exhibition was exactly to try to think about the different territories that are not reflected within this history. And so the artists were working with different regions from the Northeast to the South. And me coming from Brasilia, I started my research there. So in this modernist capital, trying to excavate a little bit of the layers of this history in Brazil. And one of the first documents that I find have got to do with a horrendous massacre that happened in the 1970s in Brazil, with a community of people that live in the upper part of the Amazon that are self-denominated Quinhá, but denominated by the Brazilian state Waimiri Atroari. And during the construction of a huge highway that would connect two cities in the north of Brazil, there was a number of very violent attacks by the military government in order to build this highway, this infrastructure. And it's funny, Ali, because in the beginning you mentioned apocalypse, and I feel oftentimes we imagine apocalypse as, I don't know, what's happening, I think a lot now in the Amazon, you know, it's like fires and destruction. We don't think that this apocalypse can also come in the form of the modern infrastructures that we inhabit, that are part of our lives. And in a lot of ways, for me, it was very, and I think for anyone seeing the film, the thing that is very daunting is that this highway, which is the very common infrastructure of modernity that we use every day, was responsible for the massacre of so many people at one time in order to build it. Now, what happens with the question, Miki, is that 10 years after this crimes had happened, so in 1985, a couple of educators that are part of the progressive field of the missionary church in Brazil went to do an alphabetization process, in English, a literacy process with this tribe, and asked them what they needed to learn in this context. And they said, well, we need to learn Portuguese in order to defend our land. We need to learn Portuguese in order to defend our rights. And what he proposes to them is for them to use a bilingual system and teach Portuguese, but also find a way of writing Kinja, their native tongue. And little by little, as they start drawing, as you can see in the film, what you'll see is the fauna, flora, myths, and the ontology of these people in the form of drawings, because that was the most simple method of knowledge exchange between them in the beginning, until they start actually drawing the whole apparatus of the military dictatorship with their guns and their big trucks and the rifles and the military uniforms. And they ask an incessant question to both the teachers. They would ask, what is the white powder that is dropped on us that we burn inside? We want to know, what is that and why have they done this? And the question is, Aquí, Miki, why? Did Kamya, meaning the civilized, killed Kinya, why Miriatroari? And this was a question that, of course, the teachers could never answer, and that I don't even think that we can answer today. But in a lot of ways, I felt that it was important that this question remained in the film as it is now.
Thirza, maybe we could come back to your film. I wondered maybe if we go more into the content of it, how you kind of came to bring these different ideas of extraction together, that of resource extraction of the land, which obviously disrupts life, but also the specific idea of indigenous children and procreation of, continuing indigenous communities.
Yeah, I mean, basically it's just because extraction, like resource extraction, is so much a part of colonialism. And over the last few years, there's been a lot of stuff in Canadian, well, I don't know, at least in my community, talking about indigenous children being apprehended, and sort of the connections between not just they're not just being apprehended because they think we're bad parents, but they're being apprehended because it is financially profitable for these organizations to give them to white foster homes. And it's sort of like a continuation of the 60s scoop and all this relocation of indigenous children to other communities. And then so I was kind of when I make a video, I'm thinking about all of these things, but also at the time I was getting eggs retrieved to try to do an IVF cycle. And I was researching, because obviously it costs a lot of money, and I have some of my pharmaceuticals are paid for by the government because because my community has treaties with the government, but I mean, they'll pay for as much birth control as you want, or things like that, but they won't pay for fertility drugs. So it's really obvious where they're what they are protecting and what they aren't. Yeah, and actually in the end that fertility cycle didn't work out, but I'm so glad I did it. But yeah, so it's just the whole thing is it's just colonization and trying to survive, and trying to make communities and seeing them get torn apart. And and now since the egg cycle thing didn't work out, I'm looking into adoption. But then there's also it's almost there's a part two, because it's because I want to adopt an indigenous child, but is that child actually is that child coming from a home that actually was not working out, or is that child also been scooped up from a community that loved them and needed them? So yeah, it's an ongoing situation for everybody here.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting about your practice is that you make a lot of work. You're quite prolific, and all your different videos are kind of continuing to ask these questions that kind of come up. It sounds like you might now make another work that's kind of reflecting on the next steps of these things. And I saw another video of yours which was kind of talking about, which I think you touch on at the very beginning of this piece, this question of getting a grant that's coming from funding sources that are involved in resource extraction. And your other video was kind of questioning your role in the Whitney Biennial in relation to some of these things. So I just wondered if you could talk a bit about this idea of complicity in, you know, capitalism, but also these kind of like settler colonial infrastructures, and how your practice is kind of constantly navigating those things.
Yeah, I mean, it's especially hard with like, because I do need funding to make art. Like I do self-fund some things, but obviously I need funding. And so there's definitely like non-ethical places that give money for the arts. And there's like a whole thing about art washing around that. But I think also like lately I've just been thinking like a lot about the complicity I have, like even in resource extraction here, even as an indigenous person, you know, like there's, you know, like I have, like I'm talking to you on a computer that's probably full of like all kinds of minerals from like colonized countries and stuff. And, you know, it's like, it's like you can't get away from it, and it's really frustrating. And I wish there was a way to opt out, but it seems like we're kind of stuck in the system right now and not really sure what our options are to sort of like be better communities and not, you know, like fuck over communities like overseas and stuff.
Yeah. And maybe that's kind of back to what Anna was saying as well. Like maybe that's what the apocalypse looks like, is being stuck in this cycle of, you know, not being able to get out of being part of the system. Maybe Melisa, we could jump over to you. And I think, you know, similarly, I think the way you bring in Google Maps as a way to like see your family's trajectory and to think about geography also kind of brings in this kind of, I don't know, like a way in which this big corporation is able to kind of monitor, surveil all of these places that we inhabit. And I think, you know, the film is really interesting in the way that you bring us to these very specific locations that are very personal to you and your family, kind of through this like mega lens of this corporate platform. And I wanted to have you tell us a bit about your choice to kind of then radically like locate the production of the film in your studio, and to make us very aware of kind of the material process of making the work. Because I feel like often films like this that are made with, you know, Google Maps or somehow navigating the internet kind of remain very digital, but then you really decide to make us aware of your process, of your studio, of, you know, taking these digital images and rematerializing them. So could you speak about that?
Yeah, so the project started with Google Earth. I mean, the first scene or sequence in the film is how I started. I mean, that was the beginning of the script. So I was playing around Google Earth and thinking, writing the voiceover, and I recorded this test, like with my voiceover, and this path between France and Argentina. And I had that with a bit of these first questions about, is it my home or my house, and a bit of this and that. And in relation to the distance, well, it doesn't matter. And then I had that, and I felt, yeah, it was interesting. I mean, there was something about seeing a person exploring the earth in Google Earth that was a bit mysterious. But then I felt I wanted to I don't know how you say in English, to give it a turn, to like go a bit further. And that is literally what we came up with, like going further in. So I found this tool of the zoom very interesting in the software, because for me it's very like you're in Google Earth and you see the house, like this is my house, and this is where I lived before, this is my ex's house, and this is and you feel you're there. and you can go in the street view and you're even closer, and then you want to get closer, and then that's the limit, obviously, of the image. So I wanted to play with that, with like the limit of the image, and how it's just an image. It's just pixels, it's just stains that, you know, can be easily washed away, or like, so it was a bit, I mean, my idea is always a bit of, as you said, like this big macro lens of this big corporation, and like, and we're surrounded by that, no? All images all the time, images of everything, digital images, photography, and but in the end, it's just images. It's nothing more than that, and that is a bit the thought really behind that. That it's just pixels. It's just a bunch of stains put together that form this image, and that we think that is reality.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, and therefore with this idea of, okay, pushing the boundary of this image, was that came all the rest of the film, all the film, and the history of my family and everything came from that gesture of breaking the image.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Kevin, I wanted to hear you talk a bit more about your formal process with the film, because I'm imagining, you know, you went and shot a bunch of footage, and the film really kind of came together in the editing, and I think it was really interesting choice how you decide to kind of frame the film with this one sequence of the pilot doing this like test, turning around. I don't know if there's a name for that, but
I think they told me, but I forgot.
Yeah.
Spinning.
But you know, it remains so abstract to us, and I think that's kind of what's so beautiful about it. There's this internal logic and choreography that we don't have access to, and I think that's always what's so interesting about your work, is that you're making these portraits, but you're not making like descriptive stories of what's happening in those places, and you're very interested in, you know, the composition of the shots and kind of maintaining a focus on the image and kind of these abstract kind of elements that come out of those things. And so I wondered if you could just talk about how you approached shooting in that space, but then also, you know, kind of deciding to structure the piece around this one sequence.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, like, I think when I create these things or make these things or build these films, I want the people on screen to be smarter than the audience. So I don't kind of give them, so I don't give the audience like, you know, like we say act one. We don't I don't give them an establish in those, so what's going on. So they got to kind of catch up. And that particular gesture was probably the best audio I had. And then I was hoping to get like, when I got there, I was hoping to get like, you know, like Bon Jovi, like all the soldiers doing these kind of tasks and stuff like that, or a full magazine, like a full 10-minute clip. And that was the only exercise that was that I can formally compose interesting at a 10-minute clip for a magazine. And so, of course, there's another film, just Recovery, just him spinning for 10 minutes. Right. And so this one, I just kind of extended the sound and, you know, like build it around that, because it was the most cohesive audio. Because I got a lot of footage, but not a lot of good audio, because nothing else was going on around it, so to speak. And so I think sometimes when I direct the task, it doesn't look good. But when they're doing the task, when they like internally know what they're doing, then it looks better, I think. And then also too, you know, like I always try to, you know, film like, you know, the films I make, although I collaborate with a colleague of mine, but you've seen those films with Claudrina Harold. And in those films, they have to be, there has to be an invitation to them, because there is about the University of Virginia and African Americans. But for my films, like there's no invitation, just like, just like the hostile, there's nothing. So, I like, whole idea of abstraction, no idea of like, that they become self-referential, they only like the reference themselves and stuff. And then they don't really need an audience to, there's no kind of pictorial where there's an audience, like there's nothing to kind of engage, so to speak, So they'll do their task without us being there, so to speak, they're not doing it for us or doing it for themselves. And so that's always a tricky way to kind of frame things up. So they'll like play out like that. Yeah. So, yeah.
Anna, would you talk about your process of being on location there at the highway, and also with Egidio, how do you say his name? Egidio. And in his home, and working with the archive that he, I guess, I don't know if he's the keeper of this archive, or I mean, I know he was the educator who initiated this this drawing project, but how you came to bring the images, the drawings, and overlaying them with the sites that you visited there in person.
It's almost like it seems serious to call Egidi's house an archive, because it really is like, it's his house that's open for everyone to come visit if people want to. And the drawings are, they're kept in a little dossier made out of paper. And of course he lives in the depths, like in the beginning of where the jungle really starts to, become very dense. So they're, being eaten by mold and by time. So there's certainly not a very monumental or formal aspect to this archive. So it's very alive, And also I think there's something important as to why perhaps this archive is still kept in such conditions, is that when the literacy process was stopped, because the entity that is meant to look after indigenous rights in Brazil, when they find out that the drawings are reflecting on this traumatic history, they come and they stop the process. And as they stop the process, Egidio takes the drawings with him, because he was taken like in the night. They were there working, and they arrived from Funai and said, "You're out of here." And since then, they can't have any contact. So in a lot of ways, those drawings are perhaps a living memory of this period, and also he knows very important evidence to what had happened, but evidence that, of course, under the state surveillance, is evidence that you have to be tactful and careful as to how you distribute this. So it actually took me almost a year to find him, because there was no phone numbers. He's in a very, very small town, 2 hours away from Manaus. And finally, when we were able to locate him, to find him, was through a friend who helped, like, making the film, who you see in the film, you see her hands, and it's Kayla who's talking to me on WhatsApp. That's what you hear in the beginning of the film. And she says, "Hey, Anna, I found him after many years." And it was very funny, because she comes to the town and she's trying to find this archive, but there's no indication of the archive. There's no name of the house. There's no precise address. The only way she could recognize that the drawings are there is that she saw a red flag that supports the previous government, the PT government in Brazil, and went, "I think it's here," and just kind of clapped her hands, and he came out. So as you can see, the whole context of this archive is really it's really being kept. Like, he's the keeper of these memories, but not a gatekeeper, but a keeper. And for me, the most uncanny aspect of getting to meet him and getting to see these drawings for the first time, which I had only seen in very simple, like, photocopies in the first report of Truth and Justice made in Amazonas, was that I say to Kayla, who's taking me there, "Oh, Kayla, on the way there, I'd really like us to stop to film the BR 174, which is the BR that we see in the film." And I thought,
which is the highway.
The highway.
Yeah.
The highway. I thought it was going to be somewhere else. And she looked at me and laughed and said, well, Anna, you know, we can't get there if we don't take this highway. This is the highway that takes us to his house. And for me, this was very ominous, because it was as if in order to understand, to connect the pieces of this traumatic history, I had to traverse the very infrastructure that was responsible to the crime. And I didn't have a lot of film, so that's when I started filming. And I knew that in a lot of ways, it was the trip there that would structure the film. So it was the trip through the highway to Egidio's house and the trip back, knowing that there we are near where the Waimeria Troari Reserve begins. And the river that you see in the film is the river that will go up to where they live. So in a lot of ways, I was trying to connect what I was seeing in the drawings to the environments that I was in order to make them come alive again.
Mm-hmm. And can you kind of touched on this a little bit, but how did the drawings come to be part of the truth report? Yeah.
So the report of truth and justice, memory, truth and justice of Amazonas was an effort.
And who put together this report?
So it's an effort made by a number of people working in forensic, working in human rights and indigenous rights in Brazil. So it's a group of people that are coming from anthropology, indigenous leaderships, and Egidio himself. This was a report that took many years to put together, and I know that not everyone who participated on it signed in the report, but Egidio was certainly one of the coordinators of this, of the drafting of this report. And as the coordinator, he brings the drawings that were made during the literacy process as evidence of what had happened there. And this report is, you know, it's vastly available. It's online. Anyone can read it, even though there's very little knowledge and literacy around it. So for me, I was very stunned that, you know, for the majority of people that I would speak in Brazil, no one knew that had happened, even though it is an available document. You know, anyone can read it. If you read Portuguese, of course, it's not translated.
Right.
Yet.
Well, we're just about out of time. Are there any final thoughts or questions you might have for each other, or anything you want to add about your film that hasn't been said?
Thanks for inviting me to the film festival.
Yeah. So happy to have you. Wish you were here.
Yeah. Yeah, there's certainly difference, you know?
Yes, certainly different.
But a very interesting program. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, I'm so glad.
Yeah, it was a good selection. I think they spoke to each other really well.
Thank you. Glad. Well, thank you all for being here. And I hope we all get to see each other in person someday soon.
Yeah.
And thank you again so much for the films. I'm sure our audiences who will be dispersed throughout the US, because anyone in the States can watch our programs online this year, which is actually new. You don't have to be in New York, so that's exciting in a way, but I'm sure they'll all get so much out of your film. So thank you so much.
Thank you.